I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1704 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, Dr. Bob Rodrigues, a history professor up at Duquesne University in Pittsburg, Pennsylvania, is going to tell us all about the rise of Ngo Dinh Diem. He was the first democratically elected president of South Vietnam. It's a very interesting story. I advise you to have pencil and paper ready because you will probably want to take some notes. Also, get rid of all your distractions. Turn off your cell phone. Tell the people in your house to stop making noise because you're going to be listening to a very important story about one of the pivotal events in our history that affected a lot of people in this country. It's something we really need to know because we don't want it to happen again. We need to be on the alert for these things that come up. Dr. Rodrigues does an outstanding job of laying it all out in simple terms to help you understand how all this came about. In this episode, he's going to be talking about the rise of President Diem. In the next episode, he's going to be talking about the terrible way he fell out of power. So right now, sit back, relax, and listen to Dr. Bob Rodrigues tell us all about how Ngo Dinh Diem became the president of South Vietnam.
Hi, Mac. I'm glad we're back. Today, our focus is going to be on the rise and fall of Ngo Dinh Diem. Ngo Dinh Diem was in power in Vietnam from 1955 to 1963 when he was brutally assassinated. He was the first democratically elected president of South Vietnam. Prior to that, they had been under an emperor by the name of Bao Dai. He defeated Bao Dai in an election in 1955, and Ngo Dinh Diem became the very first president. Diem's family had always been on the fringes of Vietnamese government going back for centuries, but he was the first one who now soared to this status as president of South Vietnam. Ngo Dinh Diem was a devout Catholic. He had traveled to the United States in the early 50s and entered a seminary. He was even considering the possibility of becoming a monk. He never married. Accounts about his time at the seminary indicated that he was very pious. When the monks would get up 5:30 in the morning for prayers or mass, Diem would already be in his pew praying, meditating. He would help the other monks do dishes and clothes. This was usually not done by a dignitary from another country, but Diem did that. However, Diem was extremely rigid. He was not flexible in his thinking at all. He stuck to his beliefs even despite evidence to the contrary. He wanted American money and materiel, but not American advice. He kind of looked upon us as babes in the woods in regard to Asia. We did not understand the psyche and the thinking of the Vietnamese. So he tried to keep us at arm's length there. He was, in many ways, he was arrogant, aloof. He centered everything around his family. He brought his whole entire family to live to the Gia Long Palace with his mothers, his brothers. extended family. His one brother was an archbishop to Vietnam, appointed by the Pope. And his other significant brother was his younger brother, and his name was Ngo Dinh Nhu, Nhu. And Nhu was probably one of the sharpest of the Ngo family. And he took over the position of the head of the police, the secret police. And what he did is to keep his brother into power. He tried to repress any kind of dissidence against the regime in Vietnam led by his brother. He used outlandish tactics. He used torture. He would break up any kind of meetings. He would put huge numbers of prisoners into cells that weren't fit for that number. He just really brought about terror in the hearts of so many of the Vietnamese who were afraid to, look in any kind of different fashion. Otherwise, they did not pay homage to the regime of Ngo Dinh Diem, then they might be considered suspicious. Now, one of the biggest groups there that posed a problem for the Diem regime was the Buddhists. The Buddhists were a religious sect that were very prominent in Vietnam, over 80%. And many of them were in the government, in the army, and all the arms of government. And yet, as you will see, they are going to be repressed by a number of Diem practices and laws and dictates, which actually try to elevate the Catholics into government and to put them into higher positions. Now, keep in mind, we mentioned last time that once the elections came in 1955, there was a mass exodus of Catholics who came from the north down into the south. The estimates are between 700,000 and 900,000, and they formed somewhat of a basis of support for Ngo Dinh Diem and his regime. Diem was very arrogant in many ways, as I mentioned, and he would really be aloof in his actions with American ambassadors. He was friends with Ambassador Nolting. Okay, Nolting was the ambassador when Ngo Dinh Diem came into power in the late 50s, and Nolting respected him and saw that Diem had a very difficult job with keeping together South Vietnam. See, South Vietnam, in addition to the many the religious sects and the differences there, they also had some odd religious sects. They were spring-offs, and then they had leaders, and there were also bosses within there, petty bosses. There was one man by the name of Bao Vien who controlled the prostitutes and a lot of the drug trade there. And he was quite powerful, and Diem had to deal with him. So, yes, he had some very difficult chores ahead of him to bring together the South Vietnamese government into some form of stability. But he himself was very, very flawed in that regard because he could not really create a coalition. What he did with these other groups is he went to war with them. There were battles in the streets. In some cases, blocks of Saigon were in ruins because Diem would send his troops up against the little armies of these other groups. So it was quite a hodgepodge that was going on. And what he was doing, too, is he was beginning to alienate the Vietnamese people with his behavior and his actions. By empowering his brother, Ngo Dinh Diem, he really created a wedge between himself and the Vietnamese people. He would go out at the urging of the United States, believe it or not, one of the few things he agreed with them. He would go out on these public relation tours of the countryside. And he started to like that because he heard some cheering. Of course, the cheering was organized. It wasn't grassroots. It wasn't just responsive. It was encouraged by Americans in the crowd who were pushing the crowd to be a little bit more responsive. But Diem, he deferred to his brother. He also deferred to his brother's wife. Her name was Madame New. And in essence, she was almost like the first lady because Ngo Dinh Diem was not married. Okay? So this is the situation that we have in Vietnam, 1955 to the early 60s. There was clear resistance. We're going to see the birth of the Viet Cong in 1959 or 1960. But you have resistance in the countryside that is beginning to build up against the Ngo Dinh Diem regime. Well, at this point, let's just stop for a moment. And for the last time, I'll mention Dien Bien Phu. And the reason why is because it was kind of a crossroads of American foreign policy. See, after World War II, the global picture was what we call the Pax Americana, okay, the American peace. And there were three main elements of that Pax Americana. Number one, the United States believes strongly in the liberal capitalist system. This is what won us the war, the great efforts of the home front to equip our soldiers and our Air Force and our Navy with what they needed to be able to overcome the Nazis and, of course, the Japanese and in the Pacific and all over the world. So that was the first thing. The second part of the Pax Americana is that we were very wary of the communists in Asia, and we supported Japan in Asia as a bulwark. And by that I mean, what had already happened in China, fallen to communism, Korea is on the horizon, and of course, what's going on in Southeast Asia. But we had propped up Japan at the end of World War II. And Japan wrote in their constitution that it was unconstitutional to have an army. So therefore, we were the basis of their military support. Now, from what I've looked at, as late as 2018, there were 50,000 American troops still stationed in Japan. But they do have now a very small army because we encourage them to start to defend themselves. The third part of the Pax Americana was that we had suffered a little bit of a loss of pride with the Iron Curtain victory by the Soviets in Europe. So there was a little bruise there. So in engineering the Pax Americana, again, we believed in the liberal capitalist system. We were wary of the communists in Asia. And three, we were a little bit bruised by the loss of Eastern Europe to the Soviets. If you look at these three, this dovetails well with what we talked about last time with the containment theory. See, this mixes, this dovetails nicely and shows you American thinking at this point, why we now are going to take over in Vietnam. 1954, the French leave Vietnam. This is July of 54, and of course, this is where the transition of power occurs. The French left, and they even took their buildings with them. Some of the buildings were prefab, and they just folded them up and took them off. So they were, in a way, sore losers because they had lost to what they considered was an inferior army. But nevertheless, it was the end of the French Empire. The United States MAAG, that stands for the Military Assistance and Advisory Group, were American personnel who began training people in Vietnam. Well, the MAG group existed in the early 50s to help the French. They worked out of Saigon, but the French didn't use them very much. But now, in November of 1955, the MAG begins to train South Vietnamese forces, what we know as the ARVN, ARVN. So this advisory group beginning, again, we do not have combat soldiers in Vietnam, but we have advisors. Now, in 1957, the communist insurgency escalates in South Vietnam. Over 400 South Vietnamese officials are killed, oftentimes brutally. 13 American personnel were wounded, and there was one KIA. Let me tell you his story. His name is Captain Harry Griffith Kramer Jr. All right. He actually comes from Pennsylvania, a town called Johnstown. And he was training a Vietnamese soldier to throw what was like a melinite block, okay, which is a French military explosive left over from the French. And it detonated prematurely. And it killed Kramer instantly. And there were others, many others that were wounded. Now, Kramer was not initially added to the wall. He was not initially added to the wall, but his sister, I believe, petitioned that it was his son, petitioned that he be put on. And in 1983, he was added to the wall. Now, he's not in the order. Now, of course, the wall is arranged in the order of death in Vietnam. But there are many out of order now because of additions to the wall over the last 28 years. There was another casualty that occurred in 1956. And I'll just briefly tell you about his story. His name was Technical Sergeant Richard B. Fitzgibbons. He was killed on June 8th, 1956. He had gotten into an argument with a crew member, and later that day, the crew member got drunk and shot and killed Fitzgibbons. So it was actually a murder. His son, Richard Fitzgibbons the third, because he was Richard Fitzgibbons Jr., also went into the Vietnam War, and he too was killed. So it was a father and a son who were on the wall in Washington, D.C. Now, he was not put on the wall until there was a movement by his sister, and he was added in 1999. The son had already been put on a wall because he had died in combat. So that's just a little bit of a background there. We're going to talk about the first two people who were at the very top of the wall, and they were originally considered the first casualties of the Vietnam War from the American side. Just a little context at this point. This is 1957, October, and this is the time that the Soviet Union launched the satellite we know as Sputnik. Now, I mention that only because it shows you that the Cold War was intensifying. Okay, so we have what's going on in Vietnam, obviously. It wasn't on the front pages of the newspaper yet. It was just a fringe war. But the Cold War loomed larger, and the Sputnik was a part of that. 1959, May, North Vietnam forms Group 559. And the purpose of Group 559 was to begin to infiltrate South Vietnam via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a trail that snaked outside of Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and had spurs that hooked off into South Vietnam. And it was the main artery by which North Vietnam would supply guerrillas in the South with material, food, supplies, and anything that was needed to prosecute the war. This group 559 was called that because it was May of 1959. Okay, Group 559. Also in May of 1959, American advisors are assigned to South Vietnamese regiments. Okay, so now we have ARVN in the field with American advisors alongside them. Okay? So now it's just we're stepping it up just a trifle. Now, July of 1959, we have the first two official deaths by American soldiers in Vietnam, and this was Major Dale Bice and Master Sergeant Chester Ovnon. Now, if you go to the wall and you stand right there in front of the apex of the wall, and you look up on the high right side, the right side is the east wall that points toward the Washington Monument. At the very height there, you'll see Dale Bice, and next to him, Chester Ovnon. They were MAG officers. They were the first, again, to officially die in Vietnam at a place called Ben Hoa. The MAG officers in many of these areas almost had like an 8-to-5 job in their training, and then they would go back to their barracks and conduct life, write letters home, eat meals. And once a week, they were sent films from the United States. Well, this was July 8th. And they were to watch a film called The Tattered Dress, which was a popular film back in the United States. Some of the officers went out and played tennis. Some, as I said, wrote letters home. But those who wanted to watch the film went into this film viewing room. At the time, the way to watch films was by reel-to-reel, 16 millimeter. There was actually two reels. The film was about 100 minutes long. And they had watched the first reel, and Chester Ovnon got up to change the reels, and he turned the light on. Well, at that point, the VC poked their weapons inside the window of their compound and just sprayed automatic fire. Ovnon was hit. He was hit, bleeding to death. But what he did do, he got up, he hit the lights, knocked the lights off, he crawled up the steps and hit the lights outside, because the switch for the outside lights was up about halfway up the steps. And what this did is this just put light on the VC that were there. Bice got up and started to go toward the kitchen door because he saw a VC there. And he was hit from behind and mortally wounded and died. But what had happened is the VC he saw in the doorway had a grenade of some kind and was ready to throw it in, but he was startled when he saw Bice. He had already pulled the pin, and what had happened was it blew up and killed him, blew up in his face and just dismantled him. There were two other South Vietnam guards that were killed, and there was a 8-year-old boy who was the Vietnamese man. It was his son, an 8-year-old boy who was wounded. He had actually poked his head through the window there. He was not supposed to be watching this film, but nevertheless, he was caught in all the uproar. So these two men are on the wall at the top of the east wall, pointing toward the Washington Monument.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bob, for that look at how Ngo Dinh Diem became the first democratically elected president of South Vietnam. I look forward to your next episode, where you're going to tell us the sad and sorry story about how President Diem was taken out of office, and how many Americans have blood on their hands in that sorry situation. Thank you again, Dr. Bob. We appreciate it greatly, and I look forward to your next presentation. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1704 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for coming to listen to these stories. You are cordially invited to come again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
Somebody, if you like what you hear, then go about that? Ain't that a mess?